On the night he rehearsed his retirement speech, my kettle began to whisper before I did, and the old kitchen clock marked each second like a witness that refused to look away. I stood very still with my hand on the stove knob and listened to a laugh that did not belong to me float down the hallway like perfume that stays after its owner is gone. The house knew before I said it out loud. Something was being planned for me without me. I eased the flame down and let the whistle fade, and I told myself to breathe through my nose the way the nurse taught me when grief sits heavy on the chest. My name is Loretta Mae Johnson. I am 66 years old. I have kept books for a living and souls for love. Numbers tell the truth when people will not. That is why I keep a red ledger notebook on the counter beside the radio, and a porcelain kettle on the stove that has a hairline crack on the handle, but still sings like a bird that remembers every hymn. Morning in our part of South Atlanta smells like coffee and damp concrete, and a little bleach from the church kitchen if the youth have been in there baking late. I open the blinds just enough so the light can sit on the tablecloth, and I work my pencil down a column until both sides agree. The clock ticks like prayer. I pack a paper bag for the pantry if I have a little more that week, and I wave to Bernice when she goes by with her choir folder. I speak to Eli at the barbershop when I drop off flyers for the senior class. This is my ordinary world. It is not loud. It is not rich. It is steady. My husband is Franklin Johnson and folks call him Frank. He is 68 and he has driven the same street sweeper longer than some marriages last. He can fix a hinge with a butter knife and a promise, and he has a way of walking into a room like he belongs to the air. We have been married more than 4 decades. We lost a baby once and we tucked that sorrow into the space where some people put a dog in a lawn, and we raised nieces and nephews and neighbor children with our time. We chose community to fill the quiet. Frank was never mean. He was sometimes careless with words and careful with his mirror. As the years stacked up, I learned which things to let pass like clouds and which to fold away like letters. That is marriage after the shine. You keep the pieces that hold. It started small. An extra splash of cologne that smelled like a hotel lobby instead of the bottle he has kept in the cabinet since we paid the car note off. A new suit that arrived in a shade of blue that thinks a great deal of itself and sat there with the tag still attached like a secret. Late evenings that did not come home with dust or grease on them. He said consulting, and I said all right, because a man nearing retirement deserves to feel useful, and I am not the kind of woman who makes a scene without numbers in her hand. But the house kept whispering. The kettle did not sing for 2 days because I did not put it on. I did not want steam to announce anything before the truth arrived. The phone on the hall table began to light up face down. The first time I asked whose text it was, he smiled the smile he uses for strangers who compliment his hat and said, just folks from the team planning my send-off. When he said send-off, I felt the smallest cold wind inside my ribs. At church on Wednesday night Bible study, Aunt Viola came in late wearing a coat meant for a colder city and a mouthful of opinions. She had been telling Frank for years that men deserve joy, and by joy she meant something that makes a woman of my age disappear. She hugged me and said, you got your condo papers somewhere safe, right? And she laughed like it was a joke. The clock on the fellowship hall wall said it was not. I washed 2 coffee cups and put the kettle back, and I pressed my palms flat on the counter, and I told myself to look with clear eyes. The hall table where Frank tosses his keys had a new fob with a logo I did not know. I opened the closet to shake a jacket, and a receipt slid from the pocket to the floor. The boutique sits on Peachtree, where I go to look at the window when Bernice and I ride the bus for a downtown day. The receipt said silk blouse and gold pendant. My name was not on those lines. I took my red ledger and wrote the date and the store and the amount, and I drew a square in the margin. Squares are for purchases that do not belong to me. Circles are for evidence that might help a sister down the line. I turned the kettle on because I needed something to sing for me. The next morning Frank was sunshine and pancakes. He whistled a tune he has not used since 1998, when he won the service award. He said, we are going to have a proper dinner when I give my speech, and I already talked to the community center about the ballroom, and I told Viola to work the seating so our friends feel proud. He kissed the top of my head like a man in a commercial, and he left with an empty pail because he was not going to work at all. I stood at the sink and stared at my hands. The skin there has thinned the way paper does when you have turned the same page too many times. I asked the Lord to help me balance the book of my life the way I balance deposits. The study door was cracked when I walked by. The laptop screen slept, but the little light pulsed like a heartbeat. Frank had used the same password for 20 years. It is the date we met and the name of his high school team. This time that old thing did not open. My stomach dropped slow the way an elevator does when you forgot which floor you pressed. I tried his birthday. I tried his mama birthday. No. I closed the lid neat and went to sweep the porch. If a thing will not open with the key it has always used, then the thing is not meant to open for you. But I am a woman with eyes. In the afternoon my friend Candace called while I was wiping down the front room tables. She said, "Do not hang up mad at me, I love you and I would not keep a thing from you, and I need you to hear this with your feet on the floor." She said she saw Frank in a jewelry store at lunch with a young woman with a coat that swings when she turns and hair laid like a magazine. And she said he had his hand on the glass and she had her hand on his arm. I said thank you. I did not cry. I put a hand on the counter to steady the room and I looked at the clock until the second hand taught me how to breathe again. I poured tea and the steam laid itself across my face like a soft cloth. I know my husband. When he lies his left eyelid twitches in the third sentence and his shoulders sit too high. That evening he came home with a grin that did not match the hour. He told a story about a planning committee and a funny joke a man named Reese made, and he left out the part where he had a hand on the glass. I made small talk and washed the dishes and set his breakfast dishes for morning because rage has an appetite, and if you do not feed it with something gentle it will devour your good sense. When he went to brush his teeth I tucked the boutique receipt under my red ledger, and I wrote down the time. Numbers do not shake. Near midnight the house made its little pops when the temperature changed and the clock clicked and the kettle sat quiet and the study door swung once like a breath. The phone on the hall table lit with a voicemail bubble that rolled across the glass like a drop of water. I do not know why the Lord had me standing there then. I pressed play and held the phone under my sweater so the light would not wake the walls. Aunt Viola's voice came through as clear as testimony. "Frank, baby, we are confirmed with Hargrove for the papers after the toast." She said she spoke to a young woman named Alana and she would be there as a colleague so nobody would raise a fuss, and she said make sure Loretta does not have anything to say because the room will keep her quiet. The word quiet hit me like a door closing on fingers. I pressed save and I stood in that little pool of hallway light and felt the world tilt but not fall. The next day I took out a folder that had slept in the linen closet since the year we signed for this place. The corner had slipped behind the pillowcases and stuck out like a child ear when they are trying to hide. Inside the old closing packet was a letter on yellowed paper in my mother hand that said gift for down payment to my daughter Loretta to be her security, and not to be confused with any man contribution. I sat on the floor with that letter spread across my knees and I felt my face soften and harden at the same time. Separate property. The phrase walked into the room like a sheriff. I took a picture of the letter with my phone. I added it to the ledger as if it were a deposit to the account of my courage. Frank came home late and he was glowing with the kind of pride that shines best when other people are looking at it. He told me the balloons would be silver and the napkins would be folded like fans and that the microphone would be set in the middle so every word could find every ear. He said it would be a night to remember. I stirred sugar into my tea and watched it dissolve. I touched my ring and felt the groove it has dug into my finger over years, and I thought about the ways a thing can hold you and the ways you can hold yourself. I did not ask about Alana. I did not ask about Hargrove. I let the room keep the shape of ordinary because I needed the quiet for my own kind of plan. Family tell me this. Have you ever stood in your own kitchen and heard your life being arranged without you and decided to stand still so you could hear every detail? I went to the study and opened the desk where Frank keeps old warranties and church programs. In the back was a small notebook that was not his style. Inside were lists that looked like goals but felt like a map for an exit. New suit. Teeth whitening. Book ballroom. Call Hargrove. Gift for AP. The initials sat there small and smug. I touched them and said the name to the wall. Alana Pierce. The kettle gurgled on the stove as if it wanted to speak and I turned the flame low. The next morning I called my friend Patrice, who went to law school after her children left home, and who sits with women like me when life tries to write us off the page. I did not tell her everything on the phone. I told her I needed her to look at a deed and a letter and explain to me how to stand up without making a mess. She told me to come at 2 with anything that had dates and amounts and names, and that we would build a paper trail that could hold its own weight. Before I left I wrote 3 lines in my red ledger. What I know. What I fear. What I can do. Under what I know I wrote he plans to hand me papers in public. Under what I fear I wrote that my voice might shake. Under what I can do I wrote breathe first then speak plain. When I stepped onto the porch the day had the kind of clean blue that makes you think about new paint. Eli called from the barbershop door and asked if I wanted a soda for the road. I told him I needed a clear head, and he nodded like a man who has listened to elders long enough to hear the spaces between their words. At Patrice's office I laid out the letter from my mother, and the closing packet and the boutique receipt and the notes in my ledger, and the picture of the voicemail screen. Patrice did not rush me. She read slow. She asked the right questions in a voice that did not need to be loud to be strong. She said, "Loretta, your condo is your separate property by the plain language of this gift letter, and by the timing of the funds." She said, "He can try to embarrass you, but he cannot take what is yours." She said, "We will open a new checking account in your name for your pay, and your church stipend, and we will set fraud alerts so nobody opens nothing in your name while you sleep." She said, "We will let him make his speech, and then you will speak once and very clear, and then you will let paper and process do the rest." I walked home with my shoulders down for the first time in 2 days. The world had not changed. The bus still sighed at the corner. The children still clattered a ball against the curb. The clock still made its small faithful sounds. But my chest felt like a room with a window crack just enough to let the heat out. That night Frank reheated the food I had set aside, and he ate with the appetite of a man walking toward something he thinks is a better version of himself. He told me Viola had picked a place for her table, and that the pastor was invited, and that it would all be so civilized. I smiled the kind of smile that keeps the corners of the mouth from trembling, and I said I will wear my blue dress and bring my good voice. When he went to shave, I whispered to the kettle that tomorrow I would let it sing again. I would need the sound of something honest when the room tried to keep me quiet. I woke before dawn and let the kettle whisper while the clock counted soft seconds that I promised to honor with clear eyes and steady hands. Because investigation is not rage, it is rhythm. And if you keep the rhythm, the truth will meet you halfway. I took my red ledger from its spot beside the radio and wrote, "Today I will gather facts, not feelings." And the sentence steadied me the way a pew catches you when your knees falter. Suspicion had already set its table in my house, and I refused to starve in front of it, so I brewed tea and opened the file drawer where we keep our life on paper, the same drawer with warranty cards and Christmas letters from cousins who still send stamps, and I pulled every envelope that smelled like a bank or a promise. I did not break into anything, I did not trick a lock, I simply requested what I was due and read what had always been mine to read, because a marriage may shake but my name is still my name. I logged into the joint checking and printed statements for the last 6 months, listening to the printer click like a small metronome that kept me from crying, and with each page I drew small squares in the margin for any line that did not sound like us. Gas, groceries, a tithe check, those got circles. Boutique on Peachtree, hotel lunch on a weekday far from Frank route, 2 transfers labeled consulting, those got squares. I took photos with my phone of anything that felt slick, and I taped a sticky note with the exact time beside each entry. Because memory makes stories but accountants make ledgers, and I am who I am. I did not call Frank. I did not text a soul. I let the clock do its good work while the light lifted on Jonesboro Road and the bus sighed and moved on. I wrote the scent notes that kept haunting me, the new cologne that brags, the floral that lingers like an exit, and I wrote where I smelled them so I could prove to myself that my nose was not inventing pain for company. And as silly as it sounds, those small lines calmed me, because our senses keep quiet receipts even when our hearts get noisy. At 9 I phoned the credit union and asked for current balances and a list of recent authorizations, using the voice I save for unfamiliar clerks, the one that says I have all day and I will speak kindly but I will not be moved. And a young man named Troy read me the lines like he was singing back the notes I wrote in pencil. I asked if any new cards had been issued, and he said 1 replacement last week and the old one had not been reported lost, and my stomach turned cold, but I thanked him as if he had told me the weather, and I made a note to breathe. I called the utility offices and verified that no strange autopays were attached to my name, and then I walked to the table and laid it all out like a quilt. There were patterns. Small withdrawals right before long evenings. 2 identical charges at a spa in Midtown on a day Frank told me the city put him on overtime. A deposit labeled gift that I knew did not come from me. Patterns are stories that forgot their adjectives. I stood in them and listened. I opened the hall closet and pulled the old safe box we use for passports and titles, set it on the table, and said a small prayer before I lifted the lid. Not because I was afraid of the papers, but because I was afraid of the ache that follows hot on the heels of proof. My mother gift letter lay where it always has, yellowed but proud, written in a hand that ended every Y with a tail like a smile. I took a fresh photocopy at the shop near Eli Barbershop because originals are a kind of holiness you do not toss into a briefcase without reverence. Then I slid the copy into a clear sleeve and wrote separate property in my ledger so my courage would have a caption. On my way back, Bernice waved me over from her porch with that look older women wear when they are about to hand you either a blessing or a truth you do not want. "Come drink water," she said, and I did, because hydration gives you better words. And she told me that she had seen Aunt Viola walking out of Hargrove Law last Tuesday in a suit that did not belong to the weather, and that she was laughing with a gentleman who holds doors for nobody. And Bernice said she only tells me this because love without honesty is sugar without bread. I squeezed her hand and thanked her, and I promised myself not to let bitterness pretend to be wisdom. I stepped into Eli barbershop for a moment because men will tell the air things they would never say at a kitchen table. And I sat in the side chair where the aunties sit and nobody expects a haircut. And I let the low talk swirl around me like warm oil. Young fellas argued about sneakers and an uncle told a joke, and then a city worker I knew from the church picnic said he heard about a retirement dinner with a new program director who looked like a commercial, and when he described her I felt the name in my throat like a small stone that only moves when you swallow hard. When I walked out, Eli followed and said, "Auntie, you good?" And I said, "I am gathering facts," and he nodded like a soldier who understands orders. Back home I called Patrice and told her I was ready to come sit with her. I packed a simple folder, red of course, with the gift letter copy, the boutique receipt, printed statements, my ledger pages, and a single index card that said "Speak plain." Then I put a bottle of water and a soft handkerchief in my purse because grown women travel with mercy. Patrice's office smelled like legal pads and lemon oil, and she hugged me like a sister who knows you are more than your worst week. She did not rush me. She asked me to tell it once from the start with no performance, and I did, careful and steady. And she made notes without sighs. And when I was done, she separated my pile like a teacher setting up a lesson. "This is what we know," she said, tapping the gift letter. "This is what we can prove," she said, tapping the statements. "This is what we expect," she said, tapping her own pad where she wrote Hargrove and ballroom and toast. Then she spoke to me like a mirror that refuses to flatter or frighten. "Loretta, your condo is separate property based on this gift and the timing. He can ask for equity in the marriage, but he cannot take what your mother gave you. We will secure your current funds, we will create space between your daily bread and any impetuous spending, and we will set gentle but firm boundaries around communications." She asked if any joint credit lines existed I did not know about, and I said if they do they will meet the light this week. And she smiled without joy and said that light is why we are here. She suggested fraud alerts at the 3 main bureaus in case anyone tried to open something with my details while I was busy making supper, and she explained how to place a temporary alert that does not cause chaos but asks lenders to think before they say yes. She told me to change online banking passwords and to request paper statements for a few months because paper will sit on your table and call your name when you are tempted to overlook things that hurt. She did not ask me to scream. She did not dress the plan in fire. She said we will let him speak at his party and then you will answer once and let the documents go to work. And she pressed her finger gently to the gift letter and said your mother already built half this defense with a pen and a prayer. We drafted a short letter to Hargrove stating that any attempt to present legal documents for my signature at a public event would be declined, and that all communication should be routed through Patrice's office. And she kept the tone so polite that it read like hospitality until you noticed the steel stitching at the hem. When we were finished, she asked how my hands felt and I said steadier than when I walked in. And she said that is the point of paper, it steadies what feelings try to tip over. On my way home I stopped at the credit union to open a checking account in my name alone for my pay and my church stipend, leaving the joint account to limp along with what Frank contributes without letting it touch my day-to-day. The clerk was a woman about my age who wore her hair natural and her pride honest, and when I told her I wanted paper statements she said, "Honey, the mail still does holy work," and I laughed in that small way that keeps you from crying in public. I bought a small fireproof pouch for copies and I whispered a line I learned as a girl, "Keep it safe, Lord," and I slid it into my purse. Back at home the house met me with that late afternoon quiet where every object holds its breath, and I laid my folder on the table and I wrote 3 more lines in my ledger. Today I found patterns. Today I kept calm. Today I asked for help. I sat without moving for a long minute, and then I stood and did the ordinary things that keep a woman human when the plot gets loud. I cleaned the kettle. I folded 2 towels. I swept the porch and waved at a boy on a bicycle and remembered that other people are still learning to balance. As the light slid away I heard Frank Keyes and the old habit in me stood up to greet him, because my mother raised me to meet guests at the door even when the guest carries storm air. And there he was smiling like a billboard for himself, and he kissed my cheek like a man who knows a camera could flash any second. He talked about the dinner as if he were narrating a dream, table cards and slideshows, and he said Viola had arranged a table for special colleagues, and when I asked which colleagues he said you will see, and his left eye twitched when he said colleagues because he does not like plural nouns when the truth is singular. I set a plate in front of him and I listened like a court reporter. I did not argue. I did not hint. I placed my hand once on the table to stop it from shaking and his fork clinked and he asked if I was cold and I said no, my bones are adjusting to a new season. He laughed as if I had told a joke and that laugh sounded like a door closing, not on me this time but on the man I married. After he went to bed I called Bernice and told her I was all right, and she said she would sit on her porch with the light on in case I needed to see a friendly glow through the night, and I loved her for understanding how a small lamp can make a woman braver. I texted Eli to ask if he could print 2 extra copies of a flyer for the church forum on budgeting I had promised to help with, and he said Auntie I will print 10 and hang the first 2 myself, and I smiled into the dark because community was already answering questions I had not yet asked. Near midnight the kettle hummed the way it does when water barely remembers fire, and I took it as a sign that I had done enough for one day. Family, if you are listening from a chair that has known long years and a table that has seen both feast and famine, hear me. Suspicion will try to turn you into a detective who forgets she is also a person. Do the next right thing. Ask for the paper. Write the truth in your own hand. Let friends hold one corner of the heavy thing. When the clock ticked past 12 I closed my ledger and placed my index card on top where it could catch the morning light, and I practiced my one sentence in a whisper so soft even the curtains could not repeat it, and I felt the strange calm that comes when you know the storm has a schedule and you have an umbrella and a way home. On Monday I treated fear like ice and set it in the sink to melt while I worked because strategy is not fire, it is a slow kettle that never boils over. And if I wanted justice I had to keep the flame low and steady. I called Patrice first and told her I was ready to move from gathering to guarding. She said meet me at 10, bring your red ledger, your gift letter, copy your statements and you're quiet. I packed the folder and the index card that carried my one line and I put the porcelain kettle to a low whisper so the house could hear the sound of something honest while I locked the door. The sky wore a pale blue that made everything look possible, and I thanked the day for arriving on time. Patrice's office felt like a calm hallway between storm rooms, and she motioned me to sit and set my papers in a neat stack that made me feel taller. She spoke like a metronome for courage. We start with what is yours. We protect what is shared. We give foolishness nowhere to live. She pulled a legal pad and drew 3 simple boxes and I loved her for how unscary she made a battlefield look. The first box she labeled separate property and slid my mother's gift letter into it like a flag. The second box she labeled access and she wrote in a small clean hand passwords, card statements and credit checks. The third box she labeled stage and she wrote retirement dinner, guest list, microphone and witness. She smiled at me the way a good coach looks at a runner who has been carrying groceries and grief and still shows up to the track. Then we began. I called the credit union from her phone so a calm voice could anchor mine, and I asked to change online credentials to something new, and to return paper statements to my mailbox for the next 6 months since paper is a cousin of truth and does not vanish when you blink. The clerk said she would be glad to help and read me the news cycle date, and I wrote it in my ledger and underlined it twice because bills like to play hide and seek when they smell a fight. Patrice nodded and then asked if any automatic transfers could give a stranger a path into my day-to-day. We made a list and I crossed out what did not belong in the same room as my groceries and my tithe and my medicine. She had me open a modest checking account in my name, only for work pay and church stipend, and she told me to let the joint account handle Frank habits without letting it touch my kitchen or my sleep. She explained in plain words what a post office box could and could not do, and we decided to keep my own mailbox because I wanted neighbors to see me get mail like always. Stability is a kind of prayer. Next came the part that would have scared me last week, but now felt like washing a wound so it can heal. Patrice guided me to place gentle fraud alerts at the 3 bureaus so any lender would pause and call me before handing my name to a stranger, and she warned me not to panic if a letter arrived with stern words since letters often bark louder than they bite. She said do not freeze your whole life down to a block of ice unless we must. We are not hiding. We are just making sure the front door has a lock that works. I breathed deeper. I put the phone down. I could feel my shoulders drop the way a suitcase does when it finds the floor of a motel after a long highway. We drafted a simple letter to Hargrove on Patrice's letterhead that said any legal matter must come to counsel, and that I would not sign anything at a public event, and that any attempt to stage a signature under pressure would be declined. Patrice read it aloud in a voice that sounded like a porch light left on for a daughter, and she handed me a copy from my folder. We did not threaten. We informed. We let the paper wear the spine so my voice could wear the silk. When we finished access, we moved to stage. Patrice asked me to walk her through the ballroom plan as if I were setting chairs for a church banquet, and I did. The community center. The white cloths. The slideshow. The microphone in the middle so every word can find every ear. Alana listed as a colleague. Aunt Viola near the front so she can hum her approval. I placed Rev Curtis in my telling because I had already decided to ask him to open the room with prayer. Patrice smiled. A prayer is a witness with hands. Invite him. Invite Bernice too. Not to clap. To hold your eye line if your breath runs away for a second. And sit near an aisle so you can rise without scraping your chair. The little things keep a woman from stumbling in a room that hopes she will. I pictured the room like a quilt with squares of safety and squares of noise, and I put my feet on the safe squares in my mind. I decided to wear the blue dress that keeps its shape and low heels that know their job, and a simple necklace that does not flash. I laid my ring in my jewelry dish and traced the pale groove it left and told my hand thank you for carrying both weight and grace. I went home to pack my evidence into a slim red envelope, because theater hates neat parcels and I wanted to deny foolishness, even the pleasure of loose paper. Into that envelope I placed the copy of the gift letter with my mother's firm script, my printed statements with the squares I had drawn around lies dressed as errands, the boutique receipt with its too bright price, the credit union note confirming paper statements, and the letter Patrice had just sent to Hargrove. I added my index card at the back where my one sentence waited like a small tool. A woman keeps under the sink for when a pipe tries to flood the house. I slid the envelope into my purse and stood at the sink and let the kettle warm the room. Steam curled up like something forgiving, and I let my eyes close for one breath. And then another, and I practiced saying my name with a microphone in front of me. The secret to a mic is to let it work while you do less. I told myself I would speak once and let paper do the rest, and then I would sit down and let the clock take over. In the afternoon I walked to the community center under a sky that had decided to be kind. The director is a woman with arms that could lift tables by herself, but who prefers to ask teenagers because asking is how you build men. She showed me the ballroom and the place where the mic cable runs and the outlet that throws a fit if you do not ask it nicely. I asked her where the podium would sit, and she said right there in the middle like a confession booth, and I said good, because truth deserves the center when lies have been working the edges. I asked if there would be a spare microphone, and she laughed and said, baby, this is not my first program, and she opened a drawer and showed me another mic asleep in its foam bed. I thanked her and kept my thank you simple because I wanted to save my voice for the night that wanted to steal it. When I stepped outside I called Rev Curtis and told him I had a favor that would sound like a sermon but was really a guardrail. He said, say no more, I will be there, and I will open the room with 15 words about honesty and 10 words about love, and I will close my eyes while you do what you came to do. I said thank you, Pastor, and he said, no, Loretta, thank you for teaching a class the pulpit cannot. I hung up and felt my legs steady under me as if they had remembered their work. At home I changed every password like a woman sweeping behind furniture. She moved when spring arrived, and I wrote each new key in my red ledger in a code that makes sense to me and nobody else. I set calendar reminders on my kitchen clock brain that said check statements when the mail comes, and I put a clean pen beside the radio, so I would not be searching when feelings tried to outrun facts. I walked the rooms the way a captain walks a deck before a crossing. I checked windows. I wiped counters. I folded 2 towels and set them square and even. This is not about a show, I told the house out loud. This is about dignity returned to its shelf. Around dusk Bernice knocked like a neighbor who respects your door, and I opened it like a woman who appreciates a friend. She handed me a small jar of soup and a bigger jar of silence, and I took both. We sat for 10 minutes and spoke of collards and shoes because women like us know that if you talk only about pain it will forget it is not the landlord. When she left she touched my elbow. Call if your voice needs company. Company can sit on the porch and never cross the walkway. Boundaries can hold hands with love. After she left I set my blue dress over the chair, and my shoes beneath, and my purse on the table where the red envelope could keep watch. I stared at that envelope until it became less like a weapon and more like a door key. The idea of revenge tried to knock with loud shoes, and I let it stand out there and cool off. This was not vengeance. This was a ledger correction. This was a woman marking the column where truth belongs. Before bed I did something I did not plan. I took the wedding album from the shelf and sat cross-legged on the rug and let myself look. I saw the boy face on the man who will stand in front of a room and call himself honest. I saw myself in lace and hope, and I forgave that version of me for not knowing what would walk in at 66. I closed the book and put it back and washed my face like I carry my own skin on purpose. Near midnight the kettle sang a soft song and I let it finish because a song belongs to the throat that starts it. Then I slept. Morning came with a frank light that told me the day had no time for wobble. I made oatmeal and thanked it for being boring. I wrote 3 lines in my ledger. Today I will speak once. Today I will be plain. Today I will walk out. I called Patrice to confirm she had received a delivery receipt from Hargrove office. She had. She also told me that Hargrove was known for trying to turn living rooms into stages and that he would not get that chance tonight. She reminded me of the breathing trick a choir mother taught her. Breathe into your back, not your throat, and your voice will belong to you, even when the moment tries to rent it. I practiced in the kitchen until I could feel my ribs widen a little like wings that remember air. In the afternoon I went to the credit union to pick up a small book of checks for my new account, not because I plan to write many but because a check is a line you draw that says this amount and not a penny more. The teller slipped them to me with a smile that tasted like respect, and I left feeling like a woman who could buy her own time. On my way home I stopped by Eli's shop to thank him for hanging the budgeting flyers, and he told me he had heard whispers that a certain gentleman was planning a grand finale at his dinner. I told him finales are for fireworks and we are too close to dry grass for that. He grinned and told me he would pray the sound system worked right for the truth if not for the music, and I laughed because laughter is a kind of oil that keeps a plan from squeaking. Back at the condo I allowed myself one last rehearsal. I stood by the sink. I looked at the clock. I found my breath in the space behind my ribs. I spoke my name. I stated my years. I lifted the gift letter like a lantern. I named the spending like a list of weather reports. I said my one sentence. You tried to spend my years but you cannot buy my dignity. I heard how it settled in the air and I knew the line was not angry. It was simply accurate. That made it stronger than anything fire could do. The hour came. I dressed. I placed my purse on my shoulder and felt the red envelope press into my side like a friend tapping the back of my hand during prayer. I locked the door with a calm wrist and stepped into a sky that had decided to glow for somebody. I told the Lord thank you for lending me a voice that belonged to me and nobody else. In the car I did not play music. I let the tires speak the road and I let my bones agree with the plan. I parked at the far end of the lot so I would have a long straight walk to practice being a woman who does not hurry for drama. The doors opened. The cool air touched my face. The room gleamed like a promise someone had polished too hard. Aunt Viola came toward me in a dress that wanted attention and I gave her a nod that wanted none. Frank stood at the front in his blue suit and he beamed like he had invented the color. I found my seat near the aisle. Patrice caught my eye and put 2 fingers on her wrist like a nurse reminding me of a pulse. Rev Curtis put a hand on the podium and whispered a prayer that was so short it felt like a key turning in a lock. The program began. I folded my hands to keep them from telling on me. I listened to tributes that sounded like a chorus written by people who love a man and do not know what else he has been loving. I felt my stomach rise and then settle. I remembered to breathe into my back. I waited for the moment to arrive, and when it did the room could not pretend it was just a room anymore. I did not know the shape of what Frank would say, but I knew the shape of what I would answer. There is a peace in that. You do not need a script when you came to bring a ledger. You only need a column and a line and the will to write the truth where it belongs. The stage was set. My voice was ready. My papers were in their order. I reached into my purse and placed my fingers on the edge of the red envelope, and I felt the texture of the paper. And I told myself one more time that I was not coming to win. I was coming to balance the book so I could sleep. The ballroom glowed like a promise polished past the truth, and the air smelled faintly of lemon oil and money dreams while the projector hummed in the corner and the round table sat waiting to witness something none of them had been invited to see. I felt the cool from the vents touch my collarbone, and I let it steady me the way cold water sobers a face before church. People I had known for 20 and 30 years lifted their glasses and told stories about Frank fixing lights and coaxing old machines to behave, and I kept my hands folded in my lap to keep them from telling on my heart. On the wall a slideshow held the younger faces of our life, and the pictures moved like a river that pretends it never carried any storms. I watched a photograph where I stood in a white sundress in front of the condo the day we paid off a second-hand sofa, and I let that memory pass through me without bitterness because I needed every ounce of breath for the hours ahead. Aunt Viola glided from table to table in a sea-green dress that wanted attention, and she patted shoulders like a campaigner who already counted the votes. Near the back, a man with a briefcase and a face carved into polite lines sipped water and watched the room with the patience of someone who profits from waiting. Hargrove. Alana sat 2 tables away in a dress that cost somebody time, and she smiled at strangers in a way that said she had practiced the smile in mirrors that do not judge. When she looked at Frank, the smile sharpened. He adjusted his blue suit as if the fabric knew a job was coming. Rev Curtis stood when the program called his name, and he walked to the podium like a man who has buried 2 generations and still believes in light. He said a blessing that felt less like ornament and more like permission. He thanked God for long work and honest wages and for truth that does not need an escort. He said amen as if he were handing me a key, and then he sat. The MC with the bright tie announced open remarks and people stood to speak kindness. Frank clasped his hands with the humility he keeps in his top drawer for public nights and dipped his head at every compliment like a man soaking himself in approval. I kept my face still and concentrated on my breath moving in the space behind my ribs the way Patrice taught me. The clock on the back wall clicked through minutes as if it too were ready to be done with this. At last the MC reached for the microphone and said, "Let us welcome the man of the hour," and the room shook with gentle applause. Frank rose and the suit did what it was bought to do. He stepped to the center where the microphone waited, and he took a breath as if he planned to wear honesty like a borrowed coat, and return it quickly before anyone noticed the tag. He thanked the Lord for seeing him to this day, and he thanked the city, and he thanked the crew, and he thanked the woman who stood by him all these years, and every thank you carried the weight of a door about to close. He spoke about seasons and new chapters and second chances, and the words sounded like a song that grew sweet while walking toward a cliff. He said sometimes 2 people grow in different directions, and the room murmured like a crowd hearing thunder far off. He said we must be brave enough to admit when a history has taught all it can teach and that love can be honored without being chained to old forms. And he looked at Alana just long enough to educate anyone not yet alive to the story. I heard a chair leg scrape and I knew Hargrove was ready to stand when the script told him. Frank gestured with an open palm as if inviting a gentle storm. He said Loretta deserves peace and I deserve peace, and in our golden years we should both have what fits, and the word fits made me think of a dress refitted by someone with scissors who never asked the fabric if it wanted to change. He said some transitions are best handled with dignity, and then he nodded toward the back where the man with the briefcase had composed his face into a soft smile. And he said, "Tonight I will be transparent with my community because community deserves the truth," and the room nodded because rooms like to be praised. I felt a wave rise in me and I let it pass and leave me more sure than water. He began to speak the sentence that would set the trap, and he looked down at the notes he had folded carefully like a map to a better life. The microphone carried his voice just enough for me to hear the tremor under the tone. He said, "After this celebration we will be moving forward with a mutual understanding," and at the phrase mutual understanding I stood. Chairs whisper when an old woman rises with purpose. I did not hurry. I did not frown. I walked to the aisle I had chosen so I would not stumble, and I placed my hand on the back of the chair in front of me for 1/2 second like a dancer taking a partner from a stranger, and then I stepped into the aisle and moved to the center where the microphone lived. The MC reached out to stop me because MCs are taught to keep a program tidy, but he saw Patrice behind me and Rev Curtis to my left, and he let the moment make its own order. Frank froze in that man of the hour pose a man uses when a camera cuts to him early. I came to stand beside him and the room hushed itself the way a congregation does when the Holy Ghost moves in a manner nobody scheduled. I waited for the quiet to finish arriving, and then I spoke my name because names are anchors in water that looks calm but is not. My voice sounded like mine and not like a woman who had swallowed a storm. I said my name is Loretta Mae Johnson. I have been married to Franklin Johnson for more than 4 decades. I have balanced books for as long as I have known how to hold a pen, and I have learned that numbers will tell on us if we give them a chance. I took the red envelope from my purse and laid it on the podium like a steady hand lays a hymn book down. I did not pull everything at once because theater loves clutter, and I wanted order to be the star. I lifted the first page. It was the copy of my mother gift letter written in a hand that made every Y into a ribbon. I said before we married my mother gave me the funds to secure our home as my safety, And I quoted a line where she wrote not to be confused with any man contribution, and I let the quiet do its work. I held the letter high enough for the front tables to see the shape of it because a silhouette of truth can be as strong as the details. I placed the letter back into the envelope and lifted the printed statements with the small squares I had drawn around lies wearing errands like coats. I did not read amounts because I am not here to embarrass a man into honesty, I am here to free a woman from a script. I said over recent months funds left our account in patterns that did not sound like us, and I kept my tone level because shame grows loud when it cannot find a calm target. I held up one boutique receipt and let the gold price wink under the lights, and I set it down again. I lifted my phone and clicked to the voicemail screen where my own sweater had hidden the light when I first listened. I did not play the audio because I am not a child with a toy. I said a message exists that describes legal papers after a toast, and a suggestion that a room would keep me quiet. I said I do not need this room to hold my voice. God already does that for me. I breathed into my back and let the breath widen me until my voice belonged to me again. Alana shifted in her chair like a student caught reciting a line in the wrong class. Hargrove stood a little then sat when Patrice turned her head a fraction. Frank looked at the floor because floors are kinder than eyes. I said I will not be signing anything tonight. I will not be agreeing to anything introduced with a stage and a witness stand dressed as a linen table. I will not send a woman into her 70s hunting an apartment because somebody decided youth is a fragrance you can borrow from strangers. I will walk out of here with the same dignity I walked in with, and tomorrow paper will do what paper does best, it will sort what belongs to whom. I paused to let the hum of the projector finish a slide as if the machine wanted to turn away. Then I delivered the line that had been waiting in my bones since the moment I found my mother's letter. I looked at Frank and did not hate him because hate is heavy and I needed my arms for other things. I said, you tried to spend my years but you cannot buy my dignity. The words left my mouth and settled on the tablecloths like a thin layer of snow that somehow warms a field. Someone near the back said well, followed by that long church hum that means a truth has landed. Another table whispered a soft Lord have mercy that carried no sarcasm. Rev Curtis bowed his head as if to thank the sentence for doing what a sermon sometimes cannot. Hargrove began to gather his papers with the stiff hands of a man who has lost a card game he stacked himself. Alana pressed her lips into the shape of a line that would not speak. Aunt Viola stared at me with eyes that searched for a version of me she could manage and did not find her. The MC made a movement toward the microphone and then stopped because the room had changed hands. I placed the red envelope back inside my purse. I did not look at Frank to find out if he had tears because I did not come for moisture, I came for math. I said to the room, thank you for celebrating a working man's years, and I mean that with all my heart. I said to the elders here who have daughters and nieces and church girls, listen to me now, teach them to keep receipts not only at the store but in their spirit. Teach them to write what they know and what they fear and what they can do, and to ask for help before they drown in someone else's plan. I nodded to the MC who looked relieved to be given back his job. I turned slightly to Frank and said, you may finish your program. I am finished with mine. I stepped from the microphone and as I did the air felt taller around me like a room that had just opened a window. I walked past Hargrove who tipped his head as if to admit that a porch raised me better than his practice ever could. I walked past Alana who stared at a point above my shoulder, as if there were a camera there that might rescue her. I walked past Aunt Viola who whispered, you will regret this, and I said soft enough for her to hear, and for nobody else to be hurt, I already did my regretting years ago when I mistook silence for peace. I reached Patrice and she touched my elbow like a medic checking a pulse. We moved toward the side door where a narrow hall led to the parking lot. Behind me the room hovered in a noise that was not applause and not panic and not quite gossip yet. It was the sound a crowd makes when it has to rewrite a story in real time. At the threshold I turned back for one breath, not to savor anything but to offer the moment to the God who had loaned me my voice. On the screen, as if the machine had chosen to remember our better years, a photograph showed Frank and me in our kitchen with a pot of collards and a laughter that could not imagine this night. I blessed that couple and released them. I stepped outside into an evening that smelled like cut grass and rain that had changed its mind. I stood still and let the cool wash me until my legs knew the ground again. Patrice handed me a bottle of water, and I took 2 long sips and felt the human part of me return to my mouth. She said, do you want to stay for what comes next? And I said, no, I am not a witness, I am a woman on her way home. We walked to the car and my hands did not shake when I unlocked the door. Before I got in, I looked at the building that had tried to become a courthouse without a judge, and I smiled not because I had won anything but because I had not lost myself. Through the glass I could see movement, as if the room had to find a new center now that mine was gone. I thought of the girls who would watch a clip of that line if someone recorded it, and I hoped they would hear the shape of a boundary spoken with a soft voice that still refused to bend. I drove away slow, the way you drive after a funeral when you are not sure if you are carrying grief or relief, and then the light turned green and I went home to my kettle and my clock and my red ledger, which waited the way faithful things do when a storm tries to rename your house. I pulled into our block and saw porch lights I had known for decades, and they looked the same, yet I was not. So I parked beside the hydrangea bush that Bernice coaxes through winters, and I sat with the engine ticking until the rhythm of ordinary life caught me and told me to come inside. The kettle and the clock greeted me with their faithful small noises, and I set my purse on the table and laid the red envelope on top like a flag that has completed its duty and may now rest. Then I slipped off my shoes and rubbed the spot on my finger where the ring had carved its thin pale circle over years. I stood in my kitchen and said out loud to the cabinets, "It is done. Not to win but to name the shift." And I poured water and let steam wash the smell of the ballroom from my hair. While the kettle cooled, I wrote 3 lines in my red ledger to mark the hour. Tonight I spoke once. Tonight I stayed plain. Tonight I walked out. Then I slept the kind of sleep that has no dreams, only the steady work of a heart resetting itself after a long sprint. In the morning the phone began to prove what any elder could have told me, that a truth spoken in public does not end in the room where it was said. Bernice called first to say she had prayed me through the night, and that 3 different women had stopped by her fence to say they were proud of how a lady could draw a line without raising a hand. Pastor left a message that the fellowship hall would be open all day if I needed a place to sit where the walls know scriptures and will not echo foolishness. Patrice texted that Hargrove had responded to her letter with 4 sentences of clipped politeness, and a request to schedule a private meeting next week, which meant the stage had been rolled back, and the law would now be asked to speak in its own voice. By 9 the first video clip appeared in my messages, recorded on a phone by a niece of a choir member who could not help herself, and I did not blame her. It showed me standing beside the microphone with my shoulders square, and my purse strap across my chest like a sash, and it captured the line I had carried to that room like a lantern. You tried to spend my years but you cannot buy my dignity. And when the words settled you could hear the particular low murmur that lives in church basements and family reunions and barbershops when a truth lands where it must. I watched the clip once, not for vanity but to make sure the thing remembered by strangers resembled the thing God and I did together. Then I set the phone down and washed a pan and watered a plant, because a woman must keep house even while the town is talking. By noon Eli sent me a note saying, "Auntie, the clip is making its rounds and folks are not clowning you. They are holding you up." And he added that a cousin had already added subtitles and clean audio so the sentence could live clear without being chewed by noise. He said a young mother came into the shop and cried when she heard it and said she was going to set up her own bank account, and I sat down at my table and thanked the Lord who can turn a single sentence into a handrail for somebody else. Frank did not call. He did not text. A silence appeared in the house, the shape of a tall man trying to stand small, and I did not feed it. I ate oatmeal. I checked the mail. The credit union envelope was there with a neat stack of paper that looked like order, and I filed it where paper goes when it is ready to behave. In the afternoon I swept the porch and Aunt Viola came up the walk with her mouth already loaded. She started to say, "You made a spectacle," and I raised my palm and gave her a chair and a glass of water, because kindness is a form of boundary when used well. I said, "Viola, I will not host a shouting match on my porch," and she tried once more to say that marriage belongs in private, and I said, "You are correct, and that is why I brought the papers to the lawyer and the prayer to the podium." She looked at my face and saw nothing she could use, and after a moment she drank the water and left without finishing her script. Later that day my sister called from Alabama and told me she had watched the clip twice and sent it to her daughters, and that the oldest replied with a row of simple words, "Proud of Auntie Loretta," and I felt something soften inside that had been braced for years. In the evening Bernice and 2 ladies from choir knocked with a pan of cornbread and a soft bag of collards, and we ate at my small table, and we did not pick at wounds. We talked about recipes and grandchildren and bus routes, and then Bernice prayed a short prayer that asked God to guard my sleep from reruns of the ballroom. That night I slept well again. Consequence arrived for Frank in ways I did not plan, because gravity catches its own. The morning after the dinner his supervisor called him in and asked for his badge to run a review of personal conduct. Not because a man cannot have a life, but because a city must not be dragged through a public scene by someone on its payroll. It was not a firing and I did not rejoice, it was a pause and I let it be a matter between him and his choices. By afternoon a deacon who loves him sent me a message that Frank had left the yard early with his head low, and his suit in a garment bag as if he were looking for a version of himself that fit by noon. Alana did not post anything that day, which told me she was taking counsel from mirrors rather than friends. By the second day the video had walked farther than our block. A cousin in Detroit texted a link from a page that gathers stories of women who have found their voice, and the caption read, "A Southern matriarch gives a masterclass in boundaries." I did not sign up to be anybody lesson, but if my sentence could put a little steel in another spine I would accept the unintended work. Patrice called to say the judge calendar would open for preliminary matters the following week, and that in Georgia an equitable division still had to start with facts, and we would bring the gift letter and the statements and let the judge do math instead of theater. She also told me to expect a sort of apology from Frank shaped like a request, and I said I would listen but I would not barter away my peace, and she said that is the whole assignment. On the third day Frank rang the bell. I watched him through the glass the way you look at a photograph of someone you once knew very well, and now must meet again for the first time. His shoulders sloped. The blue suit hung on him like a story that lost its plot. I opened the door and stood in the frame and he said, "Loretta, may I come in?" And I said, "You may stand right here." And we stood like neighbors on a day when the weather cannot decide what to do. He said, "I am sorry," in a voice that sounded like gravel under a thin shoe. And I believed he was sorry for the fallout, perhaps not yet for the plan. He said I was trying to transition with dignity and it got out of hand, and I thought of the word transition and how men use it when they want grace without accountability. I told him I would speak with him next week at Patrice's office with a glass of water on the table and a clock on the wall and a notepad between us, and he nodded and looked past me into the house as if memory could invite him in, but memory does not have keys. He asked if we could pray and I said, "Pastor will pray with you Sunday," and he said all right and left with the slow step of a man carrying a box he cannot set down yet. That evening a letter arrived from Hargrove on thick paper that thought well of itself. It was brief. It proposed a meeting to discuss amicable terms. It included a line about avoiding further public strain. I laid it beside the red envelope and wrote on a sticky note, "Send to Patrice." Then I returned to my beans and rice because dinner will not fix itself for a woman just because she spoke a sentence into a microphone. The days formed a rhythm I could live with. Morning tea. Ledger notes. A walk around the block. Phone calls from women who wanted to know which bank to visit first. I woke to a morning that felt like a clean ledger page, and I told myself that rebirth is not a trumpet blast but a steady pencil line you draw each day you remain faithful to your own name. So I lit the stove and let the kettle speak in its soft way while the clock tapped out a tempo I could live by, and I wrote a new heading at the top of my red notebook that said boundaries, then community, then grace, and I promised to keep them in that order, because a life that forgets boundaries cannot hold community, and a heart that neglects community grows too proud to accept grace. The first boundary was my door. I practiced opening it just as wide as kindness needed and no wider, and when Frank called to ask if he could drop by before the meeting with Patrice, I said my door is not a waiting room. We will meet at the office where the table holds both our elbows and the clock keeps us honest. And he said all right, and I could hear him swallow, and I wished him a day that taught him the right kind of quiet. The second boundary was my time. I drew boxes on a calendar for tea and prayer and walking and rest, and I told myself that an hour given to worry is an hour stolen from recovery. And when the phone jumped with messages about the video, I answered only those that were requests for light rather than fuel for gossip, because the Lord did not make my sentence to be a match that sets neighbors on fire. He made it to be a lantern for women with both hands full. The third boundary was my mind. I refused to replay the ballroom more than once a day, and when the scene tried to loop I turned it off the way you turn off a small radio that keeps finding a station you did not ask for, and I replaced it with psalms and with the sound of the bus sighing at the corner and with the memory of my mother's script on that gift letter blessing me across time. With the borders drawn, I stepped into community the way you step onto a porch that has held generations and does not complain. Bernice and the church mother started a simple circle in the fellowship hall on Thursdays for women who wanted to talk about money without shame and marriage without pretending, and they asked me to sit with my ledger and my kettle and teach how to keep receipts and how to know the difference between a surprise and a secret. And I said yes, because service is the cure for bitterness when it is offered without pride. We set out a long table with donated calculators and plain folders, and we began with hands. We passed around pens like communion, and we wrote our names at the top of clean pages. And women told the truth in a tone so calm it made me cry later in the car where nobody had to carry my tears. A teacher whose husband had a habit of forgetting birthdays, but not loans, learned how to pull her credit and ask for an alert. A widow who let her nephew manage her bills found a fee she did not owe and practiced a script to ask for it back without apology. A young mother learned to open a basic savings at the credit union and to call it her quiet jar. We prayed at the start for wisdom and at the end for rest, and we did the numbers in the middle like worship. Eli hosted a Saturday talk at the barbershop called Square Up Your Paper, where men and boys listened to an accountant in a denim jacket explain that love is not a receipt and also not a blank check. And he asked me to tell the room what a boundary sounds like when spoken without heat. And I stood between two chairs and said a boundary is a sentence that honors both God and your spine. And the shop hummed that says a lesson landed in a room that rarely names lessons as such. Rev Curtis invited me to speak for 10 minutes on a Sunday evening outside of formal worship, and he framed it as testimony plus tools. And I told the crowd that dignity is not theater, and that the most radical act an elder can do is model plain talk that leaves space for repentance and also space for goodbye. And I offered handouts. Patrice helped me prepare that listed free legal clinics and the phone numbers of the credit bureaus and a sample letter a woman could send when a cousin tried to turn her mailbox into a playground. Community met me in return, not with flattery but with work that made my back feel the good kind of tired, the kind that comes after a day of feeding people who ate every word without waste. The line from that night kept traveling as if it had legs of its own, and I did not chase it. I stayed in my kitchen with my kettle and my clock, and I watched letters arrive from places I could not point to on a map. One from a woman in Gary who said she left a table with her head high. One from a librarian in Jackson who started a series called Boundaries at the Branch with tea and forms. One from a niece who had never sent a real letter before because she always tapped with her thumbs. And inside hers was a picture she drew of a microphone planted like a lighthouse. I put the drawings on the refrigerator because I wanted my house to hear what God was building with one sentence spoken without hate. Grace began to show up in small appointments I had not set. One afternoon I was leaving the market with 2 bags, and a woman in a pink coat I had seen once at the bus stop walked up and touched her heart and said, "Miss Loretta, I saw you keep your voice when a room tried to borrow it, and I have not let anyone borrow mine this week." And we hugged like cousins who shared a grandmother and a recipe. Another day I passed the school and a boy on a scooter yelled, "You told them, Miss L," and he tipped the scooter like a hat, and I laughed out loud, which made the day brighter than it already was. At Patrice's office the meeting with Frank unfolded without spectacle. He arrived on time with a face that looked older than last week, and he sat with both hands visible, and he said his piece, that he had mistaken excitement for salvation and that he could not undo what cameras remember. And I said I did not need cameras to remember, I had lived the slow parts too. And I told him I forgave him the way an adult forgives, which is to release a debt and still collect the lesson in full. Patrice spoke like a nurse for paperwork, and she guided us through what belonged to whom and what needed appraising, and she cited Georgia law as if it were a familiar hymn. We signed 3 interim things and scheduled 2 more, and I walked out lighter because proper process is a bomb that does not shout. On the sidewalk Frank asked if he might say a prayer with me. No grand words, just a short one for mercy. And I nodded, and we stood 6 inches apart like people who know weather and loss. And he said, "Lord, teach us not to break what we cannot fix, and to accept what we broke with humility, and to bless the hands we once held." And I answered amen, and felt the kind of grace that does not erase but does allow breath to return. I did not invite him to dinner. He did not ask. Boundaries held. Weeks turned, and the life I had chosen before the ballroom began to flower in ways it could not while I was busy bracing for storms. I planted basil in a pot and watched it give me leaves that made tomatoes taste like a memory of July even in September. I joined Bernice for a morning walk twice a week, and we waved to the bus driver who started to honk a little hello that felt like a small medal. I tuned the old radio to a station that plays hymns and jazz, and I let the trumpets teach my lungs new lengths. I put fresh curtains in the front room and smiled at how cloth can change a mood. I wrote letters to 3 girls from church who are headed to trade school, and slid $20 into each envelope with a note that said, "Buy a small tool you will use every day and remember which hand you place it in." I met Alana once more, but not by plan. We saw each other on Peachtree outside the boutique where a mannequin never gets tired of posing. She paused and I paused, and we both looked at the sky for a second because the sky belongs to all of us and judges none of us. She said, "I owe you an apology," and I said, "You owe yourself an honest mirror." And she nodded as if the mirror had already spoken, and she said, "I am returning a necklace today," and I said, "That is between you and your next season," and she said, "I hope we both find a version of ourselves that can sleep," and I said, "I already started," and she smiled a real smile this time, the kind that does not ask strangers to bless it, and we parted without bitterness. On a quiet evening when the heat finally loosened its grip, I took the wedding album down again and I did not cry. I touched the page where my young face looked toward a future she could not imagine, and I told her thank you for her courage, and that I was finishing the story with the same eyes, only clearer. I wrote a small prayer in the margin of my ledger that said, keep me from pride dressed as wisdom, and from fear dressed as prudence, and from vengeance dressed as justice. Then I made a pot of tea and sat on the stoop to watch children ride circles in the last light, and I let the day close around me like a shawl that fits because someone measured me with care. On Sunday, Pastor asked if I would read a benediction, and I read the verse about truth setting us free, and I heard it land in my own ribs and loosen another knot I had not known I carried. The choir sang something so low and steady it felt like the earth humming, and afterward a woman I did not know pressed a folded note into my palm that simply said, thank you for making room for my no. I tucked it into the back of my ledger with the index card where my viral sentence lives, and I thought how both words yes and no can be holy if said in the right place. When I sit alone at the table now, I watch the clock as if it were a partner in my healing, and I hear the kettle as if it were a friend who respects silence, and I write small true things like, today I did not explain myself to anyone who had not earned it, and today I gave away a bag of groceries without telling the story of why I had extra, and today I stood in the sun long enough to feel the forgiveness I had extended washing back over me like a tide that knows my name. Family, if you are listening from a place with your own clock and your own kettle, know this. Rebirth for a woman our age is not a makeover. It is a re-covenant with the quiet parts of you that always kept score when the world did not. It is boundaries spoken in a calm voice. It is community gathered without spectacle. It is grace offered like bread with enough butter to nourish a soul. And if you wonder whether I would change anything, I would not change my sentence, and I would not change my tea, and I would not change the fact that I walked out before the room could rename me. Because now when I close my eyes at night I sleep like a house that has been cleaned after a storm, one lamp on, one window cracked, no fear of footsteps I did not invite, only the honest tick of time and a heart that knows its work. I live now inside a quieter house, and the quiet is not a sentence, it is a sanctuary. The clock keeps its gentle time and the kettle sings when I ask it to, and the red ledger rests on the table like a faithful witness who no longer needs to be called to the stand. And I wake with my name intact and my breath unhurried. I water the basil, I fold the towels with the care my mother taught me. I open the blinds so the light can sit where it pleases, and I tell the day thank you for arriving. Frank and I meet only where paper belongs, at Patrice's office under a clock that does not argue, and we speak as two travelers exchanging maps at a crossroads. No blame, no poetry, only the plain words that let both of us walk on. When I pray I do not ask for a different past. I ask for a clean present and the courage to keep it clean. Sometimes I lift the wedding album and bless those younger faces without inviting them to run my life. Then I set it back knowing memory is a porch and not a prison. Neighbors wave and I wave back, and the street feels like itself again. A place where children chase a ball and elders keep a chair by the door. Where Eli sets out his sign and Bernice carries hymns in a pocket. Where the bus sighs and moves on and the air smells faintly of soap and cut grass. I have learned that dignity is not the sound you make in a microphone. It is the way you wash a pan after speaking, and the way you carry a grocery bag without explaining why you have enough to share. It is the grace to forgive and the wisdom to keep the boundary that forgiveness built. On Thursdays in the fellowship hall we pour tea in open folders and women write their names on clean paper. We talk about money like it is not a secret and about vows like they are not disguises, and we leave with shoulders lower because truth has weight but it also has hands. Sometimes a young woman lingers to ask how to tell a cousin no without losing Sunday dinner. And I tell her a boundary is a sentence with love at the beginning and a period at the end. Sometimes an elder squeezes my fingers and whispers I thought it was too late for me, and I say it is never too late to put your name back where it belongs. Letters still come from places I have never stood, each one a small candle, and I set them by the radio and let their light mingle with the old songs. I am not famous and I do not want to be. I want to be useful. I want the sentence God gave me to live where it was meant to live. In kitchens and break rooms and porches, in quiet offices and loud barbershops, wherever women and men are deciding what respect will sound like in their mouths. When I see Frank from a distance I wish him mercy because mercy is the only weather that grows anything after a storm, and I wish the same for Alana, not as a prize for what was done but as a door for what can still be mended in a soul. I bless Aunt Viola too, and I ask the Lord to redirect her boldness toward something that builds. As for me, I hold to 3 small rules. Keep my door as wide as kindness needs. Keep my calendar honest about rest. Keep my mind watered with scripture and neighbor laughter so fear cannot plant itself. If you are listening tonight from a chair that has held you through many seasons, if your kettle is whispering and your clock is counting and your heart is wondering whether to speak, let me place this on your table. The truth will not always make you popular, but it will make you free. Justice does not always look like thunder. Sometimes it looks like a woman standing up and speaking once and sitting down and letting paper and time do what they do best. And rebirth does not mean you become someone else. It means you become yourself with the volume turned back to the right level. I am Loretta Mae Johnson, 66 and grateful. And I am living proof that a calm voice can carry a boundary across a crowded room. If my story steadied you, tell me where you are listening from and what sentence you are ready to claim for yourself, because somewhere a niece is watching and waiting for your example. If you would like more stories that travel from betrayal to investigation to justice to the soft work of beginning again, subscribe and leave a note so I know what you need next. And if this one helped you breathe easier, share it with a sister or a brother who might be standing at their own microphone. Until we meet again, keep your papers in order, keep your kettle honest, keep your clock company, and remember they can try to spend your years, but your dignity is not for sale.